master of the universe is, Taplines listener? Tom Wolfe coined the term in Bonfire of the Vanities to describe a hard-charging, well-pedigreed finance doofus that ruled New York City in the heady, bond-trading days of the 1980s. It's a great novel and a great term, but you may be wondering what it has to do with beer. For the answer to that question, we shift our attention from the decade of greed to the more recent past. Midway through the 2010s, New York City's dormant brewing scene was amidst a renaissance, thanks in no small part to the fortuitous changes to New York State's brewery licensing program that I discussed with Brew York's Chris O'Leary in an earlier episode of Taplines. Go back and check that one out in your feed if you're so inclined, listener. Anyway, the point is, when a new craft brewery named Other Half opened its doors in 2014 beneath a highway overpass in central Brooklyn, it wasn't the biggest deal in town. But thanks to its endless barrage of hazy, hard-to-buy India Pale Ales, it would soon become one. And not just to New York City's diehard craft beer enthusiasts, either. Joining Taplines today is longtime beverage alcohol journalist, VinePair writer-at-large, and author of the hotly anticipated new book, Dusty Booze, Aaron Goldfarb, to discuss Other Half's meteoric rise from humble beginnings to coveted hype brewery last decade. Having found himself a few times in the line that formed outside the brewery on release days, Aaron witnessed firsthand a shift in Other Half's clientele and cachet as New York City's contemporary masters of the universe, finance bros basically, became enthralled by the drinkability, variety, and most importantly the scarcity of the brewery's liquid wares. Then, given the business we're in, Aaron wrote about it. The rest is beer history, and this podcast does beer history, so you know we had to have him on to talk about it. It's journalist Aaron Goldfarb, it's Other Half Brewing Company, it's how finance bros discovered Hazy IPA, and it's all right here, right now, on VinePair's Taplines. Here at Taplines, we're big fans of the free market, as you know. We love the markets. Market is magic, laissez-faire, seems pretty fair to us here at HQ. And what we're going to be talking about today is an interesting intersection of the beer market and the financial markets. What? What do those two things have to do with one another? I'm not talking about Anheuser-Busch InBev stock or short-selling Constellation brands or something along those lines. No, I'm talking about something a little bit more raw, a little bit more real. I'm talking about a moment in time last decade when a particular New York creature, a type, a guy, only really found in New York City, was all over a particular beer, a type, a larger-than-life sort of exemplar of an emerging category. We've got a lot to talk about today. And we're going to be talking about with one of my good colleagues and pals who's joining Taplines today. I'm talking, of course, about Aaron Goldfarb. Aaron, welcome to Taplines.
Thanks for having me. I always love your intros. Do you write those, or is it kind of like Eminem rap battling?
We have a strict mom spaghetti policy here at Taplines. Yeah. It is all straight off the dome, which is why a lot of times I just lead myself down dead-end tangents that I have to recover from or beg our producer to cut in post-production. But that's more about me. Let's talk more about you. Aaron, thanks for joining the show today. Where are you joining us from?
Brooklyn, New York City, about a mile and a half away from the brewery we're going to discuss today.
The epicenter of our episode today. You're here to tackle a conversation about, outsized value that markets were placing on a certain beer, which, of course, we're talking about Other Half, which, listener, you know because you've clicked into this episode and you've stuck with us so far. And we're talking about finance bros who got really, really into this specific brewery in central Brooklyn. It's sort of at the base of a neighborhood called Carroll Gardens, just about a mile where Aaron lives, about a mile where I used to live when I was still living within the borough of Brooklyn. But before we get into that, Aaron, you've been reporting on beer spirits, a little bit of wine here and there for what? I mean, at this point, you're going on 2 decades.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you're just listening to the audio podcast of this, I don't think I look like I've been reporting on it for 2 decades, but maybe I do. Yeah, I started reporting on this stuff before, back when New York had like 2 breweries.
Right. And one of them was like Heartland in fucking
which
Times
was
Square.
Which, no one was a faux brewery with just fake equipment, and no one back then had the knowledge to even know what a brewery looked like. So because there was like a copper pipe, people were like, they must be making,
Right.
millions of barrels of beer in this tiny space.
Light manufacturing, very cool. Exposed brick, totally, man.
Yeah. So that's how long I've been in the game.
Okay. So, but so you've been reporting on beverage alcohol for all this time. You dig into the culture of stuff. You've written several books on cocktails, on mixology. You've also written 2 novels at this point? 3?
I've written a few. I've written a few, much to most people's, forgetting them, but
surprise and potential dismay. Yeah.
yeah. I've gone through lots of careers, and I'll probably go through a lot more.
But you've been all over the beer space for even longer than I have. Like I started in 2010 or so. And you were already very much in the game. And what we're going to be talking about today happens about 5 to 7 years later, where, we scrubbed forward a little bit through last decade. Let's put it at 2015, 2016, whatever. Trump just got elected. New York is in a state of upheaval and, dismay and rending of garments. But as that's all happening in the broader American landscape, in the beer industry in New York, things are starting to gain momentum. Things are starting to crystallize. There's a scene, that wasn't there when you started. More than 2 breweries at that point in 2015. There's a few players in the game. Can you talk us through, or listeners through who have never been to New York City or weren't there at that time, what the scene looks like midway through last decade, around 2015 or so?
Yeah, well, you kind of need a thumbnail history of brewing in New York, and I won't go all the way back to German immigrants arriving or Dutch immigrants setting up breweries and kicking the Iroquois out of.
It's beyond the scope of our podcast.
Yeah. I talk for 4 hours, and then I'm finally like, okay, now we're at 1999.
Brooklyn
so
Brewery.
yeah. So I've written about this before.
Right.
Believe it or not, in both the 80s and 90s, not just New York City, Manhattan had major, what we would call microbrew trends back then. I believe the second biggest brewery in America, craft brewery in America, was in Manhattan, Manhattan Brewing. In the 90s, brew pubs got very trendy, so trendy that was the first time kind of, Patrick Bateman types, would go right in their suit to, hip brew pubs in Manhattan. Believe it or not, I still can't believe that. I'm not that old that I was around then, but by the time I moved to New York in 2001, it's Brooklyn Brewery, which is legitimately brewing their beer, and Brooklyn Lager is about the only craft beer that has any sort of ubiquity. Heartland Brewing, as we mentioned, and then Chelsea Brewing, which is where the Chelsea Piers is now. So for a guy like me who was interested in drinking good beer, even in college, I said, well, I like to get drunk, but not on stuff that tastes this bad. So I was always looking to try better stuff. If you were looking for that in New York City in 2001, your only option was kind of Belgian imports, Chimay, Duvel, stuff like that. So that's what I drank. And for a 22-year-old, Chimay and Duvel were like 9%, which was unheard of compared to, Budweiser.
Sure.
By the time we get to about 2010, there were no beer bars either, really. Throughout the aughts, they start appearing Blind Tiger, Ginger Man, Rattle and Hum.
Pony.
But people can... Pony. Pony Bar, exactly. People start saying, or people just repeat the offer, that you can't have a brewery in New York City. It's too expensive. There's no space. And that was just kind of taken as truth. It's literally impossible to make a brewery here. Then Six Point opens in Brooklyn in like 2004. That was kind of the first. But it really takes till about 2014 for all these breweries to start opening. I think that year you have Other Half, Finback. I think Threes opens that year. And that's the explosion. They're all in Brooklyn or Long Island City at the time, Single Cut. But it proves, their space, they're in what were at the time considered undesirable neighborhoods. Gowanus, Other Half is in Carroll Gardens, a very desirable neighborhood, but it's at the tail end, right by the highway, a gas station, and McDonald's. So that wasn't a place that, circa 2010 people were looking to live. Now, people will live anywhere in New York, and luxury high rises are put anywhere. So, these breweries really burst on the scene, and not like they weren't ballyhooed at the time. I remember the first time I think it was just simply called Other Half IPA at an Upper East Side bar called Bondurant's, and I kind of sat up, oh, what is this? Because it was kind of a hazy IPA. It was a lot different. The aughts were about making the most bitter IPAs possible. And that's why there was kind of the joke about the only people that like IPAs are these brewing hipsters, are these, people that are faking like they like. Yeah. Right. How could, and some of the beers had masochistic names, Tongue Buckler, 1,000 IBU, which stood for International Bitterness Units. So, quote unquote, normal people, normies, did not drink IPAs. IPA was the separator between a real beer connoisseur and a normal person. A normal person at the time, if they went to the Pony Bar or something, would ask, they'd say, give me something light. They might get an Allagash White or, a red ale or a brown ale. They certainly weren't drinking a Ballast Point Sculpin. That was disgusting to them. So Other Half, kind of on the backs of the Vermont brewing scene, Hetty Topper, Hill Farmstead, Lawson's Finest, were one of the first, along with a few other New England area breweries, to kind of spearhead these beers that were made with new breeds of experimental hops like Citra that, had dialed down the bitterness and were instead tropical, fruity, and then brewed in a way where they were soft on the palate. These were IPAs that normal people could enjoy because they had a nice, pleasant flavor. And that really, opened up the IPA market to everyone and launched everything else.
That ushers in what, shut up, Aaron. No, it was excellent context, and I think really sets the scene for the moment that we're going to be zooming in on here on the episode in just a moment. There's this era that we're currently living through in American craft beer is dominated by imperial hazy IPAs, right? This is a style now, double IPAs, of course, as well. The Voodoo Ranger success story coming out of New Belgium has sort of crystallized that reality that we're living in, from a drinker perspective. And personally, they're not to my taste. I don't know, but the numbers don't lie. I mean, the volume right now is in this hazy category that halfway through last decade on the East Coast was just really, to your point, starting to trickle out of Vermont, where a lot of people, consider it starting. You mentioned Hetty Topper from Alchemist, which is, I was going to ask you about that. Where is Alchemist in this scene midway through last decade in New York? Are people able to get their hands on Alchemist? Are people still doing the thing where they're running it down, the New York Thruway and paying someone on Craigslist? What's the availability of some of those original exemplars of the style in New York City at that time?
Yeah, so Hetty Topper's first brewed, I believe, in 2004 as a brew pub only tap beer, and it has no notoriety across America. You'd have to be a real beer nerd to have heard about it. A hurricane or a flood sweeps Vermont around 2010 or 2011, I forget which one, wipes out the brew pub. And so their kind of option, I think, if I recall, is to start canning Heady Topper. And this is about, I think, 11 or 12. And believe it or not, even 10 years ago, canned beer was weird. So they're
Still
putting
unusual. Yep.
this hazy, tropical IPA in a can which even says drink from the can, which was considered verboten. A lot of people suspect they said that because if you'd poured the beer out, it would have been hazy, which was considered a flaw at the time.
Sure.
Now, of course, no one cares.
Or actively seeks it out. Yeah. Right.
Heady Topper occasionally had drops at like better retail stores in New York, but for the most part, you had to drive up to Vermont, Stowe, I think, and wait in line. And I made my poor wife, who was not my wife at the time, do that at least once. And
you did the pilgrimage.
I did the pilgrimage. I mean, now Hill Farmstead, which I always slightly preferred, just because the Alchemist went all in on Heady Topper at first. That was the only beer they made, whereas Hill Farmstead was making a variety of beers. And at that time, Sean Hill, their owner and brewer, their mercurial, would that be the term? I don't know.
I think that's probably the most charitable term you could use to get away with describing Sean Hill.
Right. At the time, I don't think he believed in packaging, nor distribution. So you literally had to go to Hill Farmstead to drink. And I remember the first time I went, again, this was 2012 or so, I was at the Alchemist, and which is, for the most part, kind of in a big area. It's right by Ben and Jerry's in Vermont. And I said I was going, and the owner, the Alchemist, John Kimmich, printed me out MapQuest directions because he said you're not going to find it otherwise. Right, your phone is going to quit working. There's going to be roads that don't look like roads. You need these printed out directions, or you're going to get stuck in the woods.
Man, and even just name checking MapQuest is an insane blast from the past. Remember that?
Yeah,
damn.
Absolutely. I don't remember what this question started with, but
the question was, when does that
kind
stuff start showing up in New York City, right? Like, how much had that filtered into like the Manhattan, the Brooklyn craft beer ecosystem at that time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's surreal to think back. There's a crappy bodega on my corner now that has Heady Topper and Focal Banger, their other beer, at all times for $5 a can.
Wow.
If you told me that even 5 years ago, I would say that's impossible. These were, real like silver like pieces of, ore. Like, to have one in your hand was like, I can't believe this. You might invite several people over and share a can, and now I can have it whenever I want.
Right.
Which kind of speaks to how the beer trends have gone. But they'd occasionally make drops at better stores, maybe or bars, maybe a Sput and Dival or a Rattle and Hum, and it was a thing where it was announced on Facebook or Twitter or whatever people were using in 2014, and if you weren't at that bar or retail within the hour, it was gone.
It's gone. Yeah.
So you better live there. And that was that. I think they moved to a bigger production site, and the pandemic forced them to get more into distribution, which is perhaps why it's at my bodega now. But it's continued to be a beer, kind of like Pliny the Elder, that has a magicness to it that people still respect and love in a way that some of these other beers came and went. Even if it is a bodega beer now, it's one that people still go, oh wow, Heady Topper.
And are like pleasantly surprised that it's a bodega beer and not like it hasn't lost respect in that. It's not like
absolutely. It hasn't
anymore.
It hasn't become the so-called shelf turd, and it still tastes great. I still pick one up, just for the memories occasionally. I'm not really into drinking 8% IPAs these days, but I'll pick one up, and even my wife still has fond memories of it, despite having to stand in a line with me.
Yeah, you subject her, but she still married you anyway. So congratulations to you, Aaron. Okay, so
thank you.
We've got both the scene within New York City, and then in the, sort of northeastern beer market, which is starting to heavily inform or just on the vanguard of what would become an enormous amount of influence because of its, sort of pack leading practitioners of the style that we all know as Hazy IPA now, right? New England IPA, a lot of people call it. So Other Half opens like 2014, maybe 2015, right, early 2015, whatever.
14,
is that what it is? Yeah, thereabouts. So two things have sort of happened in the statewide thing, context, and then in the national beer context that I just want to flag for listeners, because the ground is shifting in like really major ways that I think, Other Half, has done a tremendous job of building a business, and I give them full credit for it, but it also is it's a product of serendipity in the way that so many businesses are. Like, it's half luck and half, whatever. Like, the two things I want to flag are episodes that we've previously recorded here on Taplines. In 2010, Natalie and Vinny Chilurzo, who are out at Russian River Brewing Company, opened the doors on a Saturday to do their their release of Pliny the Younger, and that's a triple IPA that they had made for a few years, and that release was over-attended. It was kind of insane, and listener, I encourage you to go back and check it out. It's, I think, the second episode we've ever done on Tapline, so scroll back in your feed. But what Natalie Chilurzo found or learned from that experience, and many other brewers did it as well, is there's a latent demand for really hoppy, really coveted, beers that are ranked well on websites such as Beer Advocate at the time, Rate Beer. Later on it would maybe become Untapped, whatever, or private Facebook groups. But in other words, like, the internet was starting to drive an outsized demand for a specific type of beer. And there had always been kind of like niche, sort of like obsessive beers. You mentioned Belgians earlier. There was a following of, geeks who would go to like literal auctions and buy bottles of Cantillon or buy, whatever. But this was something new, and this was a shift where you were just seeing an enormous amount of customer attention and excitement for specific releases. And we talk about it now as like line culture because it's a much more familiar thing within the craft beer space. But that starts to happen 4 years before Other Half opens. 2 years before Other Half opens, the state of New York passes much more friendly legislation to open up its farm bill to more breweries. The long and the short, it's very wonky, and we talked about it in an episode of Taplines with Chris O'Leary of Brew York, which I encourage you to go check out as well, listener. But the long and the short of it is, it expedites the process for brewers to get permits to brew, to become licensed to brew beer in the state of New York. And that's in 2012.
And have tap rooms as well.
And have tap rooms. So like they now have opportunities, what we know of as kind of like more of a holistic approach to the business that was restricted from most, basically all New York brewers prior to that without a lengthy licensing process. So this expedites that process. That happens in 2012 in New York. And so leading into Other Half's opening, we have kind of these forces aligning behind them. The wind is sort of at their backs. I'm not sure that they or any other brewery really knew it at the time. Of course, hindsight is 2020, and that's what we do here on on Taplines. But the idea is that as they open, like, they've got there's a lot of the pieces in the marketplace, in the craft beer culture, in the legislative landscape of the state they're operating in the city that they're operating in, that kind of primes the pump. And so I just wanted to frame that up because what we're going to talk about now is nominally, I suppose, or this is like the most fun part of the episode, or the most amusing part. A couple years after Other Half opens, you notice I mean, they're having success, right? Do they have success right off the rip, Aaron? Do you remember, like, were they received, like, really well right as they opened their doors? Because I remember going down there, they were across from, like, a McDonald's, under the original location, under the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which is, the overpass is gritty and grubby. It's, like, not a particularly nice area of Brooklyn. It's not unsafe or anything, but it's, like, it's just kind of industrial Brooklyn. Were people lining up right off the rip, Aaron? Like, wait, how did it start?
Yeah, so I first went there in the summer of 2014. Mm-hmm. And, whereas today you will see breweries or distilleries that from day one you go, okay, there is some money behind this. This is glossy. Yep. They need to make a lot of money. Yep. The original other half, the tasting room was as big as, like, my daughter's bedroom.
It's tiny. Yeah,
tiny. Yeah. You could maybe fit, I don't know. If 20 people were in there, it would be uncomfortable.
Right.
And people in the know, perhaps because this was one of the first places you could drink at the Source in New York City at the time. I'm not going to say they flooded it. I would usually go when they opened, I think at 5 p.m. on a weekday, or I can't remember what time they opened on Saturday, maybe noon. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that busy, but people were starting to go, oh, this is good, interesting beer. It's a pretty hip place to drink, urban and, as you said, in kind of a gritty area. It wasn't going to get foot traffic of people that didn't know about it because it was a street where, unless you were buying, like, whatever was being produced in the warehouses around there,
or like bulk gravel, or something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's by Brooklyn's Lowe's. Believe it or not, there's a Lowe's in Brooklyn. So it was kind of busy. It was not quite a secret, but just a cool little place to go to. I looked up some dates just to get the timeline right, and because my memory was a little off on this. So by the winter of 2014, they had their first canned release, believe it or not. I did not remember it was that early. Yeah. There was another trend.
Yeah.
There was another trend that was enabling this to happen. And not thanks to Governor Cuomo, which you did not name check, even though we should name check.
Yeah. Again, describing him as mercurial would be about as charitable as you could go.
Right. It takes a lot of mercurial people to launch an industry.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, so these things called mobile canning systems, whereas a tiny brewery like Other Half at the time did not need a massive canning system, which if you've ever been to a brewery, takes up the bulk of the floor space. These trailers could drive over once a week, once a month, twice a week. The breweries could can straight from the tank into cans and sell them 12 hours later. Literally the freshest beer, anyone had ever tasted, which was good for these New England IPAs. So they start releasing their first cans in, I think, November of 2014. I go to that release. I remember it was a freezing day. I show up maybe a half hour before whenever they're releasing it. And by the time they open their doors, there's like 20 people there. So that was the first release. And I was there. I remember they released a beer called Hop Showers, which had a cool label, but actually wasn't one of their better beers. And I think they discontinued it. Then by 2015 is when I really remember shit going down, if I can say that. They do a collaboration beer with Trillium, which was kind of the Boston version of Other Half. Had opened around the same time, had opened in an industrial area called Fort Point, had a tiny tiny tap room at the time. They do a collab. So this is the first one I remember where people coming in from New Jersey, Long Island, Philadelphia. That day, I end up standing in a 4-hour line to get the beer. And listener, that is the last time I ever did that. So that was the end of my line days. My wife came over and brought me a sandwich from Court Street Grocers. She still stayed married to me. And that was the last time I ever waited in line. And that was really when other half took off, line culture took off. And since this was New York City, some of these beer fans were writers like me. Josh Bernstein wrote a story about the lines for the New York Times. You know, people are right that get mad that things that happen in New York get more press than they probably should. If this same thing was happening in, wherever, Stowe, Vermont, it wouldn't have got as much press, but it was happening.
It was happening in Russian River. That was happening for 5 years, right? But it had never happened to an editor. And that's the joke, listeners, that news is what happens to editors, or news is what happens to writers, right? There's a bias to it. Of course, we only have so many hours in the day. You only have so much attention. If you're involved in something, you're like, this is interesting, and you happen to be a journalist, well, you know how it's going to wind its way into the media. It's because you're going to write a story about it, right? So that's interesting to say, though, right? Because there is, of course, media and social media both play a role in sort of, blowing up other half and turning it into the behemoth that it would soon become. But you were there for, what was that? That was 2015, you said?
Yeah, and I was mostly there as a beer fan, not a reporter.
And then you were like, oh shit, this is a story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people see stories that this place is impossible to get into, and they don't go, oh, well, I'll go to another place. They go, okay, now I really got to get into this place.
Yeah. That's a classic New York mentality, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what happened. And from that other half Trillium release on, for probably all the way up to the pandemic, it became a zoo.
Just
the
a
Beer
whole
Advocate
other beast.
Forums had a tracker. I'd sometimes wake up on a Saturday morning. As I said, I quit going to these releases, but I continued to be amused by them. And you wake up at 7 a.m. on a Saturday, go on the Beer Advocate Forums. There's already posts. Oh, line's halfway down center. Okay, line's wrapped around to Smith Street.
Yeah.
Okay, and it became a party scene. Where people would come in, bridge and tunnel people, and they just start pounding rare beer in this industrial neighborhood at 7 a.m.
on the street. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you'd go back to other half by the time the release was over, say at 4 PM, the street was just filled with baller bottles of beer because, these 28-year-old beer bros were not cleaning up. They were making a mess. Other half was printing money, but I think these releases were a bit of a thorn in their side.
Crowd control was a real thing.
Yeah. There aren't a lot of people that live out there, but there are people that live out there. And there's a very, very funny New York Post article about, well, you're not going to think it's funny when I say what it is. One homeowner came out with a gun and started threatening the line one of these Saturdays. And then kind of to shove it in the face of these beer bros, started drinking a White Claw in front of them. I encourage you to look up the article.
Listener, go check that out on your own time, because we got bigger fish to fry here. Aaron, I want to ask you, when you're in those lines, those early lines, the one in November 2014, and then the one in 2015 that was your last one. What's the makeup? You described beer bros. You described some bridge and tunnel people. What is the socioeconomic mix, if you had to handicap it? Obviously you didn't go around asking people their household income, but there are obvious signifiers of who has money and how much, especially in New York, where people are sort of, there's a rigid social caste that's pretty identifiable just by scanning the crowd. What was the vibe? Who was there? Who was kind of the predominant archetype that you were seeing in those lines early on?
Yeah, 99% men, almost no women that have come by themselves. Some poor girlfriends and wives that have come along and, if they're lucky, brought a Court Street grocer sandwich for you to I think this was a very middle to, lower class, only in the sense that these were young 20-somethings without probably real jobs, maybe service industry jobs, or, this was not the economic elite at the time. I certainly wasn't either. And you got to remember, once these cans, what, that Trillium Other Half release, you could perhaps buy a case for, I can't remember, $100, and then immediately trade it across the country for something else you wanted, or sell it on sites like My Beer Seller. So anyone doing that, turning $100 case into a $200 cash is not, the Wall Street elite. People would come with dollies and buy as many cases as they could and wheel them to the car to trade, sell, flip, do it, whatever they can. There was literally no way people could drink the amount of beer they were buying.
Right. And these are beers that don't have a tremendous shelf life. I mean, like, hazy IPAs, they're best drank fresh. Like, this is not a stout we're talking about where you could lay it down or whatever. When does the creature that I mentioned right at the beginning of this episode, a specific type of New York guy, shows up in these lines or starts to get a thirst, an appetite, a taste for Other Half? When I'm talking about Finance Bros, and listener, for those who aren't familiar with Finance Bros as a concept, because you are lucky enough to never have encountered one, this is, it's a type of guy who lives in a first-tier city. A lot of them live in New York. They work at the big banks or the big hedge funds. They walk around, in the early fall, they walk around with Patagonia fleeces that are embroidered with their firm's logo on them. They have a specific duffel bag. There's all these fucking markers of like the finance bro. They have a $75 haircut, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When does the finance bro, in your estimation, because you reported on this, and the story in particular that sort of anchors this episode is one that you filed for Punch in 2017. You report out this phenomenon that Wall Street jabronis, who are not, who are diametrically opposed, aesthetically at least, to these sort of bearded, quote unquote, hipsters that took to craft beer at the beginning of the decade. Wall Street guys have started to be interested in Other Half, and real fucking interested in it. When, in your estimation, having sort of lived through this scene and also reported it out, when does that start happening?
Yeah. Is $75 too much for a haircut? No, I'm kidding.
I mean, God knows what they're paying for haircuts these days. It's more, I'm bald, so it's more than I will ever pay for a haircut ever again in my life. But
no, so, as you know, Carroll Gardens is not a finance bro neighborhood per se.
And especially not at that point, right? It's since gentrified even more. Yeah, right. Okay.
I mean, these 20-something finance bros would have been living perhaps in downtown or
Murray Hill,
Upper East and West Side, Murray Hill, exactly. Maybe Williamsburg or Long Island City, then maybe in a luxury high-rise. So it wasn't a place in their backyard, but I really think it was these stories about how you literally can't get this beer that's in your own city unless you stand in line with all the other dorks.
Right.
Drove it. I mean, it's how anything happened, and nothing makes a rich person angrier than saying you can't have this thing. These poor people with money are standing in line for 4 hours while you're, doing your
spreadsheets. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Derivatives and, other words, I don't know what they mean. And you can't have it. And they say, well, that's ridiculous. I can pay as much as I want for it. And in some cases that works. But with certain resources of liquids that only so much is made of, sometimes money can't help. But, I think it starts happening around 2016 when these articles start appearing. And that was also when these services, like I think it was called the Line Guys or something.
Same old Line Guys or whatever. Yeah.
So, yeah. You could. Well, the late aughts and early 2010s in New York just were tons of not just beer lines, Cronut lines, Magnolia Bakery lines,
Hamilton
ticket line. Yeah, exactly. It was a real thing. Like something's not important unless there was a line, And so kind of a cottage industry of people who'd say, well, I have nothing better to do than stand in a line if you pay me $50 an hour, or $100 an hour. And, for a finance bro, buying 4 cases, $100 each, and then $50 an hour for 3 to 4 hours, that wasn't much of a tax on them. So I think that started happening maybe around 2016. I should also say it had long been rumored that Other Half had some serious finance bro funding, which anecdotally I saw. I never knew for sure. I once went to their 3rd anniversary party, I guess, in 2017. Not invited. I was a +1 and I was the only writer there. And it was, I think it was the first time everyone in Other Half didn't have a beard. These were Manhattan people. These were finance people. And I presumed these were the people that had, given $50,000 for 1% or whatever. I don't know for sure. I didn't.
They were
report
important
on
enough
it.
to get invites, and you didn't get an invite as a beer journalist who lived in the borough and also reported on the scene.
Beer journalist.
Yeah.
No beer journalists were there because to a weird extent, Other Half got a ton of press while never really caring about the press. They were never rude to the press, but they didn't care about the press in the way other local breweries would invite you in. Hey, come try our new thing. Hey, come to our anniversary party. They just didn't care. So, the New England IPA was also very easy for a neophyte drinker like a finance bro to enjoy. As I mentioned in that article, I think, all the kind of baller bottles in every liquid category are not bad. They just have overwhelming flavors. Macallan is really robust and sherried. Pappy is just, straight caramel and barrel. Screaming Eagle, which I've never tried, is apparently just a very, very fruity red wine. And these IPAs were just, straight boozy orange juice. So it didn't really take a connoisseur's palate to enjoy these. They were crushable despite the ABV. They had cool labels. If this is what you were drinking out, when you went to the Hamptons or the beach, it was a cool cachet thing to drink before you moved on to, Macallan or, Opus One in the evening.
Right. And it starts conversations, and you're sort of being transgressive within, sort of your comfort zone. It's like, oh, he's not drinking Patron, he's drinking Other Half. Like, oh,
can of beer.
What's going on there? Right? Like, dude, you mentioned 2 things that I want to touch on because I think the parallel is really interesting. One is that Other Half, maybe more so than any other brewery in New York City, becomes sort of a minor obsession of like a certain type of guy in the finance community, which is massive in New York City. In no small part because of its scarcity. I mean, you make the point that the Hazy IPA is much more palatable for the neophyte, and I'd buy that. I totally believe that helps it, gain staying power amongst finance bros. But the reality, as you pointed out, quite rightly, I think, is that they want it because other people can't get it. I mean, we know that's just an enormously powerful driver for, a certain type of consumer. We talked about the markets earlier, man. Like people, if the market can't get something and you have more money than everyone else, like that's enough of a reason for some rich consumers to just want it, right? And so that's like a catnip for, sort of rich people. And then you made the point about the media, and, Other Half never really seeks out media, right? Like they're not, to your point, like they're not totally standoffish. Like they'll answer emails. They've answered my emails before, whatever. But it's not the sort of thing where you get, 2 pitches a month about their new seasonal releases, or, hey, come down to the tap room. We just put in fucking Big Buck Hunter or whatever. I don't know. And no one sent me releases about Big Buck Hunter. I don't need those. But, I think that's kind of a catnip to to journalists to some, in some degree, right? Is if like, man, they don't care. Like that's, it's like there's an attitude there, whether it's deliberate or it's sort of assumed, that it makes them sort of seem more quote unquote authentic. That makes them, they're not interested in burnishing their image. They're just interested in making the beer. Now, whether that's true or not, I'll leave that to listeners to conclude on their own. But there's sort of like this idea of scarcity, both in the like media perspective and then in the market perspective, that drives this legend forward, which I think is at least worth marking. And also, I think like I think you're right on. I think that the scarcity and sort of the idea of getting something, whether it's a story or it's a can of other half that other people can't get or won't do the work to get, is attractive, right?
No, it always amused me that, you write a positive story on other half, they wouldn't share it on their social media. You write a story like my story about how Wall Street bros love it. They don't go, hey, this guy's full of crap. They just act like you didn't exist. And it always amused me. I have no idea if other half ever even read that Wall Street story. With other stuff, you get like brewers or distillers and the rumor mill, like, oh, so-and-so is real pissed at that story you wrote.
Right.
Maybe they're couth enough not to say it publicly, but you hear that. I never heard anything from other half when I wrote about them, positive or negative. I still don't even know if they know who I was. And the fact that I went to their 3rd anniversary party as a journalist and no one said, hey, why are you here? Or, hey, good to see you, Aaron, or anything, tells me they probably don't know who I was and never did.
Right. I want to quote,
which is great.
Yeah, it's perfect. I mean, that's fine for you, right? Like that's the better way to go. Just like be under the radar and do your job. And that's, I mean, listener, this is pretty inside baseball, but like, and I can't speak for all journalists, but like, I don't particularly want to hear from the people I write about, except when I need to talk about them, talk to them or talk about them. Like if they have tips for me, I want to hear about them. But like, this is a colleague at best, an arm's length colleague relationship. We work in similar professional lanes, and that's the extent of the relationship that I need out of any brewery or any distiller or whatever. And it sounds like you feel likewise. So it's not like we're saying that other half is like wrong to behave that way. Yeah. But it is unusual especially at that point when breweries were opening up one after the other and they had, an enormous amount of momentum that, they had PR firms placing stories for them, constantly hammering our inboxes, desperate for press. And other half wasn't doing that. I want to quote from, you got this great quote in the Punch story, which listeners, I recommend you go read. It's from 2017. Like I said, it was published on Punch. And it's from an advisor at Ernst & Young, who was also, it sounds like, a beer writer at Pace at the time. So he kind of straddles, both worlds, right? He knows enough about beer, but he's also kind of has some exposure to the finance, to the archetypical finance bro.
Yeah, he was an unusual, go on.
Yeah, no, totally. Like there weren't that many of them. This is what the quote is going to illustrate here. Is like, all right, so the quote is, one dude in my office doesn't know anything about beer, but is obsessed with Northeast IPAs. Like if I mentioned Kentucky Brunch Brand Stout, he would say, oh, what's that? But he would be able to tell you about every single other half beer, close quote. And Kentucky Brunch Brand Stout is toppling Goliath. It was considered then and still to some extent now as like one of the most coveted, the most coveted beers. And it's a great quote because I think it gets at like what you were talking about. It's like there's this fixation, like this tunnel vision amongst this really influential consumer who has a ton of money to throw around. And I mean, for lack of a better way or more delicate way of phrasing it, no fucking taste. Right? Like, what was the reception to this consumer, this powerful cohort of, well-funded or deep-pocketed consumers who latch on to other half, but don't necessarily even know what the fuck they're drinking because they only want other half because it's hard to get and it tastes like boozy orange juice. Like, what was the reception in the New York beer scene at that time?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same today with Pappy. I mean, I had a guy reach out to me 2 days ago, and he said, I need to buy a bottle of whiskey as a gift, and my budget is $1,500, which is absurd.
God.
And I said, I really don't think, after about $300, you're not getting much more. I'll recommend some things at that level, but I'd rather have $300, but whatever. They don't care. They want you to tell them something that. The reception at the time was kind of like amused, like, a mile away is Three's Brewing, which makes like 20 different styles,
right?
Many of them world class, and it's a more comfortable place to drink. It actually has food,
right?
The reception was there's this brewery, Finback, who makes every bit as good of IPAs and has never had a line ever. Admittedly, they were in the deep areas of Queens, so it was a little harder to get there. But now they're in Brooklyn. It was just kind of amusement, and I think a lot of hardcore beer people started moving away from Other Half just because it became a pain in the ass to drink there. They eventually got a larger tap room, circa maybe 2018, I think.
Yeah,
and it was more comfortable to drink at these other breweries, and eventually you started to realize every single New England IPA tastes the same. So, you don't have to go to Other Half every single week to get their new release because it's going to taste like the one last week.
Right.
And I'm not even saying it tastes bad. If you like that flavor profile, it's good to you. But, the joke kind of became like, are they brewing the same exact thing and just putting a different cool label on it?
Right.
I think, one of these years, 18 or 19, they brewed like 400 different beers.
Yeah.
I cataloged how many different beers appeared on Beer Advocate that year. It was like 400 different beers, like several, and there's not that many hops combinations. So eventually people just started, the real serious beer drinkers who cared about drinking the beer, not flipping it or selling it.
And weren't buying it just because it was
breweries.
scarce, like the finance bros were. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
So my perception, and I'm curious to hear your take on this. So obviously, the pandemic hits, upends everything. Other Half also expands, by the way. It is no longer just that small tap room in central Brooklyn. As Aaron mentioned, they put in a bigger tap room in Brooklyn, but they also move on and open, Rock Center. They have one in New York, and then they have a location in D.C. They just opened a location in Chicago, I want to say. So they're
Philly, Buffalo.
Thank you. Yeah. So
Williamsburg.
So the footprint for this brewery also expands, and I think and I don't think this is a critique so much as just the way things go. As it becomes more available, it becomes less of a coveted, sort of aspirational Veblen good that shows off your status, right? And finance bros, I think, move on. My perception is they've moved on. My question for you is that your perception as well, that finance bros have moved on? And if it is, where have they moved to within the beverage alcohol sort of landscape? I mean, you also read about spirits, you read about wine. Where are you seeing the heat from the customer that, maybe doesn't know what they're buying, but has a lot of money to buy it? Where is that money going in beverage alcohol these days, as opposed to back in 2015, 2016, 2017?
Well, first of all, I only go on podcasts that talk about Veblen goods.
That's right.
Burka bags and, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about Heady Topper and Pliny, which are the only two beers that have really been able to overcome, widening availability for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. They just have a magicness to them. And I think Other Half was kind of hurt by the fact that they never had one singular beer that people sought out. They made so many beers, double cheddar, broccoli, I can't even remember the names of most of these beers.
The thing is, it doesn't really matter. And that was the whole point. Is there's going to be a new one every week. It's not even worth committing this to memory.
Right. Another brewery of this era, Treehouse.
Yep.
which to a certain extent has been even more successful, has perhaps done a better job at branding single beers like Julius and whatnot. And I think that's why they're a little more coveted these days than other half.
That's why they bought a fucking golf course. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And are moving into New York State now, which is very intriguing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, once you're in this many places, and from what I understand, which is funny in this global era, when they open in Buffalo, all the locals, oh boy, we got ourselves that famous brewery from New York, and they seem to do well. Let's check back in 5 years.
Sure.
I always feel disrespected when something from another city or state, comes in, and I'm supposed to be excited that New York finally has a, Canes or a Shaken State. I'm like, this is a real city. We got our own local stuff. You got your local stuff. You don't, Chicago's a better brewing city than New York City. They don't need another half, I don't think. I don't know if there's excitement there for it. I haven't been paying attention, but yeah, it inherently is not going to be as coveted or popular.
Yeah.
As to where the finance bros have moved, I think like me and a lot of people, they have also grown older and crushing, a 4-pack of 10% double IPAs every Saturday gets very hard. We're now, other half's approaching their 10 years. So if you started going there when you were 25, you're 35. You started going there when you were 35, like me, now you're getting into your mid 40s, and they've probably moved on to families and children and fine wine, Macallan, Pappy.
Yeah.
Or, they've quit drinking altogether for various reasons.
Where, in terms of because obviously you write a ton about the spirits business, you've written about what people call whiskey mania or bourbon mania, the distortion that's happening currently in the brown liquor segment, in the whiskey segment in this country. I'm not asking for an equivalent of like another half, IPA in the spirit space, but more like what's the kind of like Emperor Has No Clothes bourbon for rich people right now?
Huh. Yeah, and I would say, the Emperor had clothes with other half.
Fair.
I would say to a certain extent, Willet, perhaps. Willet back in, the aughts and 2010s were putting out, teenage rise, 23-year-old bourbons that only those people in the know knew about. They've kind of exhausted their resources of old barrels, and now it's newer stuff. That's not bad by any means. It's just wildly overpriced, wildly coveted, and a ton younger than the stuff that really put them on the map.
Yeah.
So that's one. And Willet likewise has always been a place that just doesn't even pay attention to journalists. Don't answer emails. Don't seem happy if you write about them. Don't seem mad if you don't.
Right.
But they have, their fanboys do it more for you and for them and get mad at me if I write something bad about them, and will, probably send me death threats if they've gotten this far into the episode and I just shit on their beloved Willet. Yeah.
By the way, Taplines listener, that's very normal behavior, and we do encourage it on this podcast. Definitely harass Aaron via email. We'll give his email right at the beginning of the episode, so you have that handy. Yeah. He definitely loves to hear from you and all of your opinions about hazy IPAs and rare bourbons. So hit him up.
Thank you.
All right, closing thoughts here, Aaron. Thank you for taking the time and spending the better part of an hour here talking about this sort of. I think it's fair to say there's, if not a pivotal moment, sort of like a very of its era sort of thing where other half first gets the Sauron gaze of Wall Street bros, sort of trained on it, and all of a sudden they're paying guys to wait in line for them. They're drinking this stuff as a pregame out in the Hamptons or wherever finance bros go to vacation that I don't even know about.
Right.
What you mentioned that you think the Emperor had clothes, and I think I would agree with that. I've had other half beers; they're good. But, we've also talked about how they've expanded. They've become, sort of like less of like the it beer amongst a certain moneyed set. To some extent, that's just the pace of the market, right? Like people want new, people want interesting, whatever. What I think is maybe worth wanted to close on is like, Other Half always was new and interesting by virtue of the fact that they were always rolling out like a new beer every week. And the joke that you mentioned is one that has gone around the craft beer, ecosystem for basically since they opened, right? Like, oh, it's Citra and Mosaic and Galaxy. Now it's Galaxy, Citra, and Mosaic. And it's you got to pay $18 for both 4-packs because it might be different, right? But like they mastered, it strikes me, like especially in the New York market, this like art of just like breakneck cadence of like hype beers that were coming out again and again and again and again. And yet it's still not enough to maintain, sort of that pinnacle of demand or of, even though they're rolling new shit out every week, like eventually people just move on to the next thing. You've covered the space, you covered other parts of beverage alcohol. You've seen this cycle play out many times. What do you like learn from that, having lived through this one? Like, what's the significance of the fleeting nature of demand for Other Half when we look at it at the business and we look at the way consumers sort of like shape perception and then all of a sudden move on? Give me your take on that.
Yeah, this podcast has gotten very Milton Friedman.
That's right. That's right. We are solving the problems of overregulation. We will be seizing the means of production and handing them over to private industrialists after we wrap today. But answer my question.
Milton Friedman's favorite podcast. Put that as a blurb on your Spotify page. I think whether on purpose or accidentally, Other Half did a lot of things that did show how, stuff works. In this social media era, you need to post something new and interesting every single day, to excite people and get the fire emojis. So they did that. They did that very well. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, at a certain point, people, have nothing to latch on to. Treehouse, as I also mentioned, was also releasing a ton of different stuff. But it seems in the last 2 or 3 years, they've said, like, here are our 10 to 15 core beers, Julius, Green, Hazy, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. We're going to brew other stuff, but these are the ones that have really resonated with people and captured their imagination. People love Julius, let's just keep brewing it. Maybe it's not going to be rare or hard for people to get, but it's a touchstone. So let's keep doing that. Other Half doesn't really have those beers, and I think to a certain extent it's hurt them. Having said that, they have as many facilities as Treehouse, so they seem to both be doing well. Right, I don't know what strategy is going to, prevail. I guess we'll see in 5 years. I don't know.
And meanwhile, the finance bros will be chasing something new and previously very available that we don't even know about yet. What do you think will be the next? A rum? They going to rum? They going to THC? What are they going for, Aaron?
I could see a sort of designer gummy that costs a ton of money becoming hot.
That's a good call.
Yeah,
I like that idea.
Hey, let's cut this out of the podcast and get some investors.
Aaron Goldfarb, thank you for joining us on Taplines. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, man. You're welcome back anytime.
That was fun.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire Vine Pair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.